Decision trees are a general class of machine learning models that can be both used for classification and regression. Not only that, but they've been adapted for other applications, specifically outlier detection. And the reason why they're called decision trees is because if you were to visualize the model, it resembles a tree, complete with branches and nodes. The model is basically a set of yes or no questions, or questions that only have a yes or no answer. And not only that, but they're quite popular because they mimic the human decision-making process. If you want to decide upon something, one way about it is answering a set of yes or no questions to see where you end up with. Very similar with the decision tree model. It's a set of yes or no questions that you answer for an observation, and you see where you lie in the resulting tree. Other characteristics of the decision tree model that are popular is that they can handle multi-classification. They can work with a mix of categorical and numerical data. Not only that, but the models are pretty straightforward to understand. You can easily visualize and understand how this model works, how it's working, how is it making predictions. So it has a great transparency. And we call this transparency explicability, the explicability of the model. And if a model has a very low explicability, we tend to call those black boxes. It's hard to understand what's going on inside, how the model is working to make predictions, so it's harder to derive insights from the decision-making process. On the other hand, that is the opposite with decision trees, because we can go and construct the decision tree, this tree-like structure, and understand how it's making predictions, how it's making classifications. And we'll go and visualize these trees so we can get a better understanding of how these models work. For this example here, we're going to play around with a famous data set called the IRIS data set. So this is a set of 150 observations of 3 different species of irises. For each of these irises, we have different characteristics, like the petal length, the petal width, the sepal length, and the sepal width. And the task at hand is, can we take these 4 characteristics of these observations and train a model that can be able to accurately classify one of these flowers if it's one of these 3 species. So go and load that data set, which we do there. We're going to work with the decision tree classifier model, so it is the decision tree that works for classification. We'll talk about these hyperparameters that are involved with the model just in a bit. But once we fit the model, we're going to use this package called GraphViz, which you can use to visualize this tree. So let's run this code and we'll get the resulting tree-like structure. So notice, as I mentioned before, the model looks like a tree. Specifically, it looks like an upside down tree. At the very top is the root node. This is sort of the starting point of the tree. The way it works is that all your training observations reside in this initial root node, the starting node. And the model works by deciding what is a question that it can ask that has a yes or no answer to best separate the points. For classification, it's trying to best separate all the classes that are involved. The model comes up with, in this example here, the petal length less than or equal to 2.45. So this is the question the model has found is the best to ask to separate the points. We'll discuss later what is this metric that it's using to find what's the best question to ask. This model is using the Gini metric. This is the metric it is using to decide what is a question to use to separate the points. The samples just refer to how many observations reside in this node. Since we're using the full data set of 150 observations, all our observations start here. Value just tells you how many occurrences are of each class. We have a 3-class situation, equally distributed, so 50 observations for each of the 3 classes. So since we started with all the points here, the values field is just 50, 50, 50. The last field here, where it says Setosa, and that's going to be refer to the most common class. So we have the Setosa species. There's a varus color, and the Virginica. Notice it's a three-way tie, so I think the model just reported the first one. Okay. Depending on whether this is true or false for the observation, the points in which this condition is true, that its petal length is less than or equal to 2.45, are going to move to this left node here, and those in which it's false are going to be pushed to this right node here. So notice we take the observations, and based upon the answer of this question, we're going to separate the training points. So we split this root node into two resulting nodes. So we have this left node here. Notice in this node here, all the samples that reside in it, all 50 samples, are in the same class. So there's no need to do any further separation here. It has perfectly separated all the observations of this one class. No need to do further separations, so this leaf is no longer going to split. This is called a terminal node or a leaf. So let's consider the other branch. So we examine this other branch here, and there needs to be some further division because if we look at the samples that reside in this node, 50 of one class, 50 of the other class, there still needs to be some separation to separate both of these classes. The model has decided that the best question to ask is if its petal length is less than 1.75. If that's the case, then those observations will be split into this node. If that is not the case, those observations will be split to this right node there. So notice we're going to repeat this splitting process. It's a recursive process. At each node, we reapply this splitting criteria, this splitting process. We have to figure out what is a good question to ask, a question with a yes or no answer, and then go ahead and apply the split. Figure out which observations go to the left, which go to the right, then you repeat the process. So we created a left and right branch. At this point, we repeat the process once again. And we keep on repeating the process until that node has all the same observations of the same class, like in this example here. There was no need to split because all those 50 observations belong to the same class. Or we reach some sort of criteria, some termination criteria. When we constructed the model, here we set a max depth of 3. What this means is that the model, this tree, isn't allowed to grow any deeper than the depth of 3. So this is depth 1, depth 2, and depth 3. And if we look at these boxes, we notice that they haven't been completely separated all the observations. Notice in this box here, in this node, this terminal leaf, this terminal node, this leaf, there's 48 samples, but one of them is some other class. So it's not 100% separation. But we've met that stopping criteria, that max depth. We're not going to allow the tree to grow any deeper to separate the classes. But if we look across the board, the nodes here, these terminal nodes, these leaves, are mostly pure. In other words, they tend to be dominant by one class over the other. For example, this node here, there's 47 in one class and only 1 of another class. Here, there's not so much of a clear split. It's not as pure, but there are only a relatively small number of classes in these two nodes. So let's visualize our tree in a different way. So here we're visualizing the model, but let's see how it's working geometrically. And one thing we notice is that in this example here, in this small example, this tree of depth 3, it only uses 2 features to perform the splits. It's only looking at the measurements of the petal. It's not considering the measurements of the sepal. Because of that, we can visualize what's happening here. There's only 2 features that it's using, the petal length and the petal width. Actually, in this case, it just appears it's only, in fact, uses petal length and petal width. Sorry about that. Using both petal length and petal width. So we can easily visualize our points in a 2-dimensional space. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and take our data. Let's visualize it. Let's place it in a 2-dimensional space, and let's construct geometrically what is happening when we're doing these node splits. In other words, geometrically, what does this look like? That we're separating this root node initially into two nodes using this criteria, that the petal length is less than or equal to 2.45. Let's run this block of code here. So these are three classes of these two features that we're using for this small tree, the petal width and the petal length. So looking at this, we can already start thinking about what's a good place to perform a cut. If we were to cut our space to box in the observations, where should we apply the cut? So it looks like maybe we should go ahead and apply this cut here. Draw a line vertically here. If we do that, we perfectly separate one class on its own, and then we can further refine the process and separate these two classes. If we look at here, we understand that in this situation, it's understandable we can train a model that can do a pretty good job to separate all three classes. So let's see what happens if we set a depth of 1. In other words, we're going to go ahead and see how the model is working at this point, at this depth, that initial split, saying that the petal length is less than or equal to 2.45. Okay, so this is our split there. So notice we have two nodes. Notice we have two spaces that we created in this two-dimensional space. These two boxes. So you can think of these two boxes as referring to or as being representing these two nodes we construct from the initial split. Remember, all the observations are in one node. We perform a cut. We create two boxes, two nodes. So we create two distinct regions in our feature space. Let's go ahead and further divide our space. Let's see what happens. Form another cut. There you go. So this is our best way to separate the remaining two classes. Of course, this wasn't perfect. So let's go ahead and see what happens if we perform another cut. And this is the resulting third depth.